So welcome to Farther Down the Rabbit Hole, and what I'm going to do today is multitask. I'm going to be reading from Progress and Poverty, which is a book by Henry George, while I am sunbathing. So the purpose, I'm always saying, of health, whether it's personal or social, is a question of balance. And so let's listen to what this man had to say, who was observing the situation in the 1800s. His son, Henry George Jr., wrote a preface in 1905, and by 1905 there were 5 million copies of this book. So I think it's very important for those who are serious about trying to understand what's happening in the economy, that they understand some of the great thinkers of the past. So I'll read a few highlights here. There's one where he introduces the problem. He goes, "The present century has been marked by a prodigious increase in wealth-producing power. The utilization of steam and electricity, the introduction of improved processes and labor-saving machinery, the greater subdivision and grander scale of production, the wonderful facilitation of exchanges, have multiplied enormously the effectiveness of labor. At the beginning of this marvelous era, it was natural to expect, and it was expected, that labor-saving inventions would lighten the toil and improve the condition of the laborer, that the enormous increase in the power of producing wealth would make real poverty a thing of the past. Could a man of the last century, a Franklin or a Priestley, have seen in a vision of the future the steamship taking the place of the sailing vessel, the railroad train of the wagon, the reaping machine of the scythe, the threshing machine of the flail? Could he have heard the throb of the engines that, in obedience to human will and for the satisfaction of human desire, exert a power greater than that of all the men and all the beasts of burden of the earth combined? Could he have seen the forestry transformed into finished lumber, into doors, sashes, blinds, boxes, or barrels, with hardly the touch of a human hand? The great workshops where boots and shoes are turned out by the case, with less labor than the old-fashioned cobbler could have put on a sole. The factories where, under the eye of a girl, cotton becomes cloth faster than hundreds of stalwart weavers could have turned it out with their hand looms. Could he have seen steam hammers shaping mammoth shafts and mighty anchors, and delicate machinery making tiny watches, the diamond drill cutting through the heart of the rocks, and the coal oil sparing the whale? Could he have realized the enormous saving of labor resulting from improved facilities of exchange and communication, sheep killed in Australia eaten fresh in England, and the order given by the London banker in the afternoon executed in San Francisco in the morning of the same day? Could he have conceived of the 100,000 improvements which these only suggest? What would he have inferred as to the social condition of mankind? It would not have seemed like an inference. Further than the vision went, it would have seemed as though he saw, and his heart would have leaped, and his nerves would have thrilled, as one who from a height beholds just ahead of the thirst-stricken caravan the life-giving gleam of rustling woods and the glint of laughing waters. Plainly, in the sight of imagination, he would have beheld these new forces elevating society from its very foundations, lifting the very poorest above the possibility of want, exempting the very lowest from anxiety for the material needs of life. He would have seen these slaves of the lamp of knowledge taking on themselves the traditional curse, these muscles of iron and sinews of steel, making the poorest laborer's life a holiday, in which every quality and role and noble impulse could have scope to grow. And out of these bounteous material conditions, he would have seen arising as necessary sequences moral conditions realizing the golden age of which mankind have always dreamed, youth no longer stunted and starved, age no longer harried by avarice, the child at play with the tiger, the man with the muckrake drinking in the glory of the stars. Foul things fled, fierce things tame, discord turned to harmony. For how could there be greed where all had enough? How could the vice, the crime, the ignorance, the brutality that spring from poverty and the fear of poverty exist where poverty had vanished? Who could crouch where all were free men? Who oppress where all were peers? More or less vague or clear, these have been in the hopes, these in the dreams born of the improvements which give this wonderful century its preeminence. They have sunk so deeply into the popular mind as radically to change the currents of thought, to recast creeds and displace the most fundamental conceptions. The haunting visions of higher possibilities have not merely gathered splendor and vividness, but their direction has changed. Instead of seeing behind the faint tinges of an expiring sunset, all the glory of the daybreak has decked the skies before. It is true that disappointment has followed disappointment, and that discovery upon discovery and invention after invention have neither lessened the toils of those who most need respite, nor brought plenty to the poor. But there have been so many things to which it seems this failure could be laid, that up to our time the new faith has hardly weakened. We have better appreciated the difficulties to be overcome, but not the less trusted the tendency of the times was to overcome them. Now, however, we are coming into collision with facts, which there can be no mistaking. From all parts of the civilized world come complaints of industrial depression, of labor condemned to involuntary idleness, of capital massed and wasting, of pecuniary distress among businessmen, of want and suffering and anxiety among the working classes. All the dull, deadening pain, all the keen, maddening anguish, that to great masses of men are involved in the words, hard times, afflict the world today. And keep in mind, the world today that he's talking about is 1880. That's by the time this went to press, and this was the 4th edition, so he wrote it even before. So these are the patterns of the hard times are already seen then. This state of things, common to communities differing so widely in situation, in political institutions, in fiscal and financial systems, in density of population, and in social organization, can hardly be accounted for by local causes. There is distress where large standing armies are maintained. There is also distress where the standing armies are nominal. There is distress where protective tariffs stupidly and wastefully hamper trade. But there is also distress where trade is nearly free. There is distress where autocratic government yet prevails. But there is also distress where political power is wholly in the hands of the people, in countries where paper is money, and in countries where gold and silver are the only currency. Evidently, just a second. Oh, by the way, this is my sun water. I put it in the sun so it burns off the chlorine, because I'm drinking tap water from Manhattan. You know, Manhattan, part of the reason Manhattan's so great is the natural resources, and the water is one of the most precious resource. So I'm kind of proposing, or I'm following that understanding that everything can be a poison and everything can be nourishing, and to take it into moderation. I don't think it's a good idea to be throwing fluoride in the water. But on the other hand, if that's the society in which you live, I think it's good not to get stressed out over it and balance with it. So I'm always looking for cures that are available for really cheap for everybody. And so now I want to think about the cures for the woes of the economy, and I'm reading from Henry George. So evidently, he's saying, no matter whether the currency is paper or whether it's gold or silver, whether trade has tariffs or whether it's free, whether it's autocratic government or whether it is in the hands of the people, evidently beneath all such things as these, we must infer a common cause, because there's problems with all of them. That there is a common cause, and that it is either what we call material progress or something closely connected with material progress, becomes more and more an inference when it is noted that the phenomenon we class together and speak of as industrial depression are but intensifications of phenomenon which always accompany material progress, and which show themselves more clearly and strongly as material progress goes on. Where the conditions to which material progress everywhere tends are most fully realized, that is to say, where population is densest, wealth greatest, and the machinery of production and exchange most highly developed, we find the deepest poverty, the sharpest struggle for existence, and the most of enforced idleness. Again, binary economics is probably going to be talking about the wealth not being in terms of labor, so idleness is not of a concern. But what I do like about Henry George is it is a wonderful thing to be busy and to have tasks that fascinate you and make other people happy. So this enforced idleness is the concern, when people want to work and they can't. So I think the binary economists have to take that part into account, and I think Carl Pearson could be a good go-between on that. It is to the newer countries, that is, to the countries where material progress is yet in its earlier stages, that laborers immigrate in search of higher wages, and capital flows in search of higher interest. It is in the older countries, that is to say, the countries where material progress has reached later stages, that widespread destitution is found in the midst of the greatest abundance. Go to one of the new communities where Anglo-Saxon vigor is just beginning the race of progress, where the machinery of production and exchange is yet rude and inefficient, where the increment of wealth is not yet great enough to enable any class to live in ease and luxury, where the best house is but a cabin of logs, or a cloth and paper shanty, and the richest man is forced to work daily. And though you will find an abundance of wealth and all its concomitants, you will find no beggars. There is no luxury, but there is no destitution. No one makes an easy living, nor a very good living, but everyone can make a living, and no one able and willing to work is opposed by the fear of want. But just as such a community realizes the conditions which all civilized communities are striving for, and advances in the scale of material progress, just as closer settlement and a more intimate connection with the rest of the world, and greater utilization of labor-saving machinery make possible greater economies in production and exchange, and wealth in consequence increases, not merely in the aggregate, but in proportion to population, so does poverty take a darker aspect. Some get an infinitely better and easier living, but others find it hard to get a living at all. The tramp comes with the locomotive, and almshouses and prisons are as surely the marks of material progress as are costly dwellings, rich warehouses, and magnificent churches. Upon streets lighted with gas and patrolled by uniformed policemen, beggars wait for the passer-by, and in the shadow of college and library and museum are gathering the more hideous Huns and fiercer Vandals of whom Macaulay prophesied. See, I don't even know who Macaulay is. This fact, the great fact that poverty and all its concomitants show themselves in communities just as they develop into the conditions towards which material progress tends, proves that the social difficulties existing wherever a certain stage of progress has been reached do not arise from local circumstances, but are in some way or another engendered by progress itself. And unpleasant as it may be to admit it, it is at last becoming evident that the enormous increase in productive power which has marked the present century and is still going on with accelerating ratio has no tendency to extirpate poverty or to lighten the burdens of those compelled to toil. It simply widens the gulf between Dives and Lazarus and makes the struggle for existence more intense. The march of invention has clothed mankind with powers of which a century ago the boldest imagination could not have dreamed. But in factories where labor-saving machinery has reached to its most wonderful development, little children are at work. Wherever the new forces are anything like fully utilized, large classes are maintained by charity or live on the verge of recourse to it. Amid the greatest accumulations of wealth, men die of starvation. And puny infants suckle dry breasts, where everywhere the greed of gain, the worship of wealth, shows the force of the fear of want. The promised land flies before us like the mirage. The fruits of the tree of knowledge turn as we grasp them to apples of Sodom that crumble at the touch. It is true that wealth has been greatly increased and that the average of comfort, leisure, and refinement has been raised. But these gains are not general. In them the lowest class do not share. And there's a footnote. It is true that the poorest may now in certain ways enjoy what the richest a century ago could not have commanded, but this does not show improvement of the condition, so long as the ability to obtain necessaries of life is not increased. The beggar in a great city may many things from which the backwoods farmer is debarred, but that does not prove the condition of the city beggar better than that of the independent farmer. Okay, that was a footnote. I do not mean that the condition of the lowest class has anywhere nor in anything been improved, but that there is nowhere any improvement which can be credited to the increased productive power. I mean that the tendency of what we call material progress is in no wise to improve the condition of the lowest class in the essentials of healthy, happy human life. Nay, more, that it is still further to depress the condition of the lowest class. The new forces elevating in their nature though they may be, do not act upon the social fabric from underneath, as was for a long time hoped and believed, but strike it at a point immediate between top and bottom. It is though an immense wedge were being forced, not underneath society, but through society. Those who are above the point of separation are elevated, but those who are below are crushed down. This depressing effect is not generally realized, for it is not apparent where there has long existed a class just able to live. Where the lowest class barely lives, or has been the case for a long time in many parts of Europe, it is impossible for it to get any lower, for the next lowest step is out of existence and no tendency to further depression can readily show itself. But in the progress of new settlements, to the condition of older communities, it may clearly be seen that material progress does not merely fail to relieve poverty, it actually produces it. In the United States, it is clear that squalor and misery and the vices and crimes that spring from them everywhere increase as the village grows to the city, and the march of development brings the advantages of the improved methods of production and exchange. It is in the older and richer sections of the Union that pauperism and distress among the working classes are becoming most painfully apparent. If there is deep poverty in San Francisco, and I think he worked as a printer in San Francisco, so that must have been, I think he was born in the 1850s, much before this book was written. If there is less deep poverty in San Francisco than in New York, it is not because San Francisco is yet behind New York in all that both cities are striving for. Is it not because San Francisco is yet behind New York in all that both cities are striving for? When San Francisco reaches the point where New York now is, who can doubt that there will also be ragged and barefooted children on her streets? It's so sad. This association of poverty with progress is the great enigma of our times. It is the central fact from which spring industrial, social, and political difficulties that perplex the world, and with which statesmanship and philanthropy and education grapple in vain. From it come the clouds that overhang the future of the most progressive and self-reliant nations. It is the riddle which the Sphinx of Fate puts to our civilization, and which not to answer it is to be destroyed. So long as all the increased wealth which modern progress brings goes but to build up great fortunes, to increase luxury and make sharper the contrast between the house of have and the house of want, progress is not real and cannot be permanent. The reaction must come. The tower leans from its foundations, but every new story but hastens the final catastrophe. To educate men who must be condemned to poverty is but to make them restive, to base on a state of most glaring social inequality and political institutions, under which men are theoretically equal, is to stand a pyramid on its apex. So again, I'm reading from Progress and Poverty, which is Henry George's book, and I'll, as an aside, say that when he finished it, he gave a copy to his father. It's really interesting how he had to go about getting it printed. It was finally printed by D. Appleton and Company, but they said they'd publish it only if he would bear the main cost, because economic books weren't selling that well then. And so there was nothing else for it, and in order that the plate making should be done under his own direction, Henry George had the type set in a friend's printing office in San Francisco. Before the plates made from this type were shipped east, they were put upon a printing press, and an author's proof edition of 500 copies was struck off. One of these copies Henry George sent to his venerable father in Philadelphia, 81 years old. At the same time, the son wrote, "It is with deep feeling of gratitude to our Father in heaven that I send you a printed copy of this book. I am grateful that I have been enabled to write it, and that you have been enabled to live to see it. It represents a great deal of work and a good deal of sacrifice, but now it is done. It will not be recognized at first, maybe not for some time, but it will ultimately be considered a great book, will be published in both hemispheres and be translated into different languages. This I know, though neither of us may ever see it here, but the belief that I have expressed in this book, the belief that there is yet another life for us, makes that of little moment." And so it goes on to say, this is what his son wrote in 1905, "The prophecy of recognition by the book's greatness was fulfilled very quickly. The Appletons in New York bought out the first regular market edition in January 1880, just 25 years ago. Certain of the San Francisco newspapers derided the book and author as the hobby of little Harry George, and predicted that the work would never be heard of. But the press elsewhere in the country and abroad, from the Old Thunderer in New York, in London down, and the great periodical publications headed by the Edinburgh Review, hailed it as a remarkable book that could not be lightly brushed aside. In the United States and England it was put into cheap paper editions, and in that form outsold the most popular novels of the day. In both countries, too, it ran serially in the columns of newspapers. Into all the chief tongues of Europe it was translated, there being 3 translations into German. Probably no exact statement of the book's extent of publication can be made, but a conservative estimate is that, embracing all forms and languages, more than 2 million copies of Progress and Poverty have been printed to date, and that including with these the other books that have followed from Henry George's pen, and which might be called the Progress and Poverty literature, perhaps 5 million copies have been given to the world. So I stand corrected there. I had said there were 5 million copies of this book. what he's meaning, Henry George Jr. here, in his preface written January 24th, 1905, is that from this book, Progress and Poverty literature has sprung, perhaps 5 million copies, so that people were thinking over these ideas. And again, it's interesting because he's talking about a more primitive time, and that's why I like to go to Dayton and think about Molly's forefathers, because the revolutionary time was a time, like he described, even the rich man had to work every day. But everybody would have access to a living. He wouldn't be debased and having to become a beggar and beg for poverty, for charity. So likewise, this guy was working, he had he set the type himself, he made the plates, they were printed off, and that gives a feeling of the physicality of nature and how close he was. Now we've got the internet, and so we can have ideas flying around on the internet, and still you could spawn that literature that comes from it. I noticed when I was looking in my demographics, I had 20,000 hits after I was on Howard Stern. However, before I was on Howard Stern, just by following my heart on the 9/11 work, I think in April, I had about 8,000 hits a day. And now slowly but surely, well, a day over, it was a short time because I'd go down for the, doing work on Ground Zero, and it spiked up on a couple of occasions because it was sort of dramatic, the difference between the no-planers and the planers, and it would spike up to 8,000. But now I'm kind of stabilizing around 2,000 to 3,000. Now it looks like it's coming up as of the last few weeks, the last week or so, it's been at around 3,000 and 4,000. So slowly but surely, I expect once you kind of spawn that literature, like he's talking about Progress and Poverty, even though that book only sold 2 million copies, literature that was directly related to its thoughts came up to about 5 million, and that was in 1905. So I find it interesting to look at these numbers. And I'm expecting my work on the cancer therapies to also be causing some attention. But again, as has been pointed out by Brass Check TV, you can get people who are kind of controlling the information to sort of throw a monkey wrench in it. But I think even in that case, your knowledge and your research should be done by yourself. Don't depend on authorities, not me and not others, but see if you can be stimulated to start thinking through the science, so that even with a monkey wrench thrown into the mix, you can start to determine what's correct and what isn't. And so now I'm going to go on and read a little bit out of Cancer is a Fungus, Dr. Tullio Simoncini. He's the oncologist from Italy. And the subtitle of this book is A Revolution in Tumor Therapy. And I find, again, using models of the body and models of the society to be very useful. So here's a section. Candida shows the same genetic structure as cancer. Paradoxically, the title of this section describes something that is so relevant. It can demonstrate how Candida can actually be the cancer, but that is not even taken into consideration by official thinking. The authors cited below, although they confirm the genetic identity, report the issue in a sterile, descriptive way. I've read this before, but it's worth hearing again. G.A. Werner reports to have found the homologous sequences of DNA samples extracted from Candida glabrata, Candida parapsilopsis, and from cells of biopsy material taken from squamous cell carcinoma of upper airwaves. K. Yasumoto and S. Kawamoto, undoubtedly research done in Japan, demonstrate how the specific monoclonal antibody directed against the C cytochrome of Candida krusei also reacts in the presence of cytoplasmic fraction of the cells of lung cancer. G. Schwartzy suggests the utilizing specific antibodies against Candida in the diagnosis of malignant melanoma. E. H. Robinette Jr. describes a remarkable resistance to the inoculation of lethal doses of Candida in mice, into which a Lewis pulmonary carcinoma or carcinoma of other anatomical areas was previously implanted. A. Cassoni and J. B. Weinberg highlight a significant anti-tumoral response in mice that have been inoculated with materials from the cellular wall of Candida albicans. There is, therefore, beyond interpretations that are more or less reductive, a high degree of relationship between Candida and tumoral tissues. If we then consider the endless phenotypical variability of the mycete, together with the extreme, that means the mushrooms, little funguses, possibly the spores, the way they're growing. I talked to Dean Lorne about it, who is pretty married to the gene theory, which Simoncini is trying to dismiss, saying if it's a fungal infection, why be blaming human cells that all of a sudden have gone wild and sort of become fungus? It's not that at all. Rather, we should go back to microbiology and say that it is a seed that has found a fertile soil in which to grow, but not that it's found as fertile soil because the system has been debilitated, and that Candida comes as an opportunistic infection after the cancer's taken place. It actually was the cancer. So if we then consider the endless phenotypical variability of the mycete together with the extreme difficulty in finding and classifying the various existing stock, it seems legitimate to assume the existence of a deep genetic relationship between cancer and Candida in its various differentiations, or at least to try to understand what the deep link is between these two morbid entities. And the reason I put attention also on economics and why I'm reading Henry George now is not only because I'm hoping to produce shows for the Henry George School and get them some attention on the internet, but also because many doctors can be kind of handcuffed and married to an education and a set of obligations that the cost of that education has generated, and they can't walk away from their union, which says you can only treat in this way. Even if they want to do something other than their protocols that are allowed and kind of enforced by courts that are advised by peer-reviewed journals that block studies, they can't do it. And they can't even suggest that other therapies exist. They're not even allowed to say, I can't help you anymore. Go out and try to find something. They can't even say that. They can't even indicate that other therapies exist. And I think this is a real poverty of intellectual resource. If we don't even know the therapies that are available, if we don't even know how to process and make available research studies to the people that need these studies and to the doctors that need this uncensored information, then we really are faced with a lot of poverty right in the midst of these vast amounts of money in this healthcare, this so-called healthcare that everybody is scrambling to have. What Simoncini is saying, we don't want to dismiss as, just use baking soda and natural therapies. He wants to use it with all of the advanced technology. Right now there's a lady who would like to be able to use a $30,000 protocol that he has in his hospital in Rome, but she doesn't have the $30,000, and if she leaves this country, her insurance won't cover it. And if he comes to this country, I'm sure the AMA has ways of, you can see the wisdom behind it, to make sure that doctors who have good therapies aren't able to do them. Well, I mean, that's not why they do it. They want to make sure that you don't have some doctor who's been authorized in some fly-by-night country that can't really be a good doctor. So economics is definitely related to healthcare. And it's not just have more of healthcare whose care is questionable, but it's the healthcare itself being funded by money is questionable because it's not using that money to the best ability. I'm looking for my timer. Where's my timer gone? I'm sure this is over 28 minutes. Oh, here it is. Yep, 34.